The bar stopped. It didn't slow down gracefully or give me a warning tremor. It simply hit an invisible ceiling halfway off my chest and died. Gravity, usually a negotiable partner in this dance, suddenly became an absolute dictator. My triceps screamed, burning with a chemical heat, but the iron remained motionless, hovering dangerously close to my throat. I was alone in the rack, or I thought I was. The panic was cold and sharp, a needle in the adrenaline. I couldn't rack it. I couldn't lift it. Then a shadow fell across my face, blocking the harsh overhead lights. It wasn't a frantic rush. It was a calm, deliberate eclipse. Before I could even gasp for help, the air pressure shifted, charged with the sudden, necessary proximity of a stranger. I don't come to the gym at this hour to socialize. My life between the hours of 7 and 7 is a relentless series of high-stakes negotiations, managing boardrooms where a single hesitated syllable can cost millions. I deal in strategy, in the abstract architecture of corporate power. But here, under the hum of the industrial HVAC and the unforgiving glare of fluorescent tubes, the world is reduced to simple, brutal physics. Iron has no agenda. Gravity doesn't care about my quarterly projections. There's a purity in that silence that I need more than sleep. The gym at 11 p.m. is a different ecosystem than the chaotic, ego-driven theater of the daylight hours. It is a temple of sterile precision. The air is cooler, smelling faintly of rubber mats, chalk dust, and the sharp, antiseptic tang of sanitizer. The silence is heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic, metallic clatter of plates sliding onto bars and the occasional heavy exhale of effort. This is my reconstruction zone. I build myself back up here, rep by rep, reinforcing the structural integrity that the day tries to erode. I stood at the chalk bowl, a white dusted monolith in the corner of the free weight section. This ritual is non-negotiable. I press my hands into the block of magnesium carbonate, feeling the dry, friction-heavy powder coat my palms. It's about eliminating variables. Slippage is a variable. Doubt is a variable. I dusted my hands off with a sharp clap, a small cloud of white rising into the recycled air, and walked back to the bench. My setup is architectural. I lay back, eyes fixed on the knurling of the bar above me. I retracted my scapula, pinching my shoulder blades together to create a stable platform against the vinyl pad. I drove my heels into the floor, creating tension through my quads, arching my back to minimize the range of motion and maximize mechanical advantage. Everything was locked tight. Everything was under control. But I wasn't the only apex predator in the room tonight. For the last 2 weeks, there had been a disturbance in my solitary orbit. We hadn't spoken, not a word, but her presence was a constant, kinetic energy in the periphery of my vision. I knew her only as the new girl, though that title felt dismissive given the way she moved. Jordan. I'd heard the front desk staff say her name once. She wasn't here to scroll on her phone or take selfies in the mirrors. She moved with a terrifying efficiency, treating the weights with the same reverent discipline I did. I watched her in the reflection of the mirror wall as I adjusted my grip on the bar. She was doing deadlifts on the platform behind me. Her form was impeccable, spine neutral, lats engaged, the pull explosive yet controlled. She wore oversized headphones and a focus that walled her off from the rest of the room. She was an equation I hadn't solved yet. Usually, I can categorize people in this gym instantly. The tourists, the regulars, the show-offs. She didn't fit. She was too precise, too intense. There was a pull there, an undeniable gravity that had nothing to do with the heavy plates we were both moving. I could feel her location in the room without looking, a blip on my radar that grew louder whenever she walked past my bench. It was distracting. It was irritating. And if I was being honest with myself in the safety of my own head, it was compelling. I shook the thought away, refocusing on the steel above me. Tonight wasn't about her. Tonight was about the 185 pounds I had just loaded onto the bar. It was a number that had been mocking me for months, a plateau I needed to shatter. I checked my grip width. Ring fingers on the power rings, thumbs wrapped tight. The suicide grip is for amateurs who trust fate. I trust friction and leverage. I took a deep breath, expanding my diaphragm, bracing my core against the weight belt. The world narrowed down to the gray steel bar and the ceiling tiles above it. The silence of the gym seemed to stretch, waiting. I unracked the weight. It felt heavy, heavier than I expected, settling into my palms with a density that promised violence. I controlled the descent, lowering the bar to my sternum with a slow, eccentric cadence. 1, 2, 3. The bar touched my chest, a gentle tap, and I prepared to drive it back up. This was the architecture of control, and I was about to test its limits. I rested my shins against the bar, the rough knurling of the steel biting into my skin through my socks. But I didn't pull. Not yet. My heart rate was still drifting down from the last set, a thudding rhythm in my ears that usually drowned out the room. Tonight, though, the silence of the gym was louder than my own pulse. From my vantage point on the deadlift platform, I had a clear line of sight to the bench press station, a direct vector through the wall of mirrors that lined the free weight section. I wasn't looking at my own form. I was watching Nova. There is a specific language spoken by bodies under tension, a dialect of tremors, bracing, and leverage that you can't fake. Most people who come here at this hour are running from something. Insomnia, loneliness, the quiet of an empty apartment. They lift with a frantic, jagged energy, throwing weights around to make noise, to prove they exist. Nova was different. She didn't lift to make noise. She lifted to silence it. I had been tracking her progression for 2 weeks, analyzing her movements with the detached appreciation of a mechanic listening to a finely tuned engine. She was a study in structural engineering. Every setup was identical. The way she kicked her feet back, the precise arch of her spine, the way she drove her shoulder blades into the bench. It was a ritual of absolute containment. I adjusted my weight, leaning back on my heels, letting the chalk dust settle on my thighs. We hadn't exchanged a single word. No pleasantries, no requests to work in, not even a nod. Yet the air between us had thickened, charged with a static that felt heavier than the plates we were moving. It is a unique intimacy, sharing a space this large and this empty with only one other person. You become hyper-aware of their orbit. I knew exactly when she was resting. I knew the cadence of her breathing. I could feel the shift in atmospheric pressure when she moved from the squat rack to the bench. It was a silent, kinetic conversation we were having, through the reflection in the glass. A game of observation where looking too long felt like a breach of contract, but looking away felt impossible. She was loading the bar now. I watched her slide a 45 and a 25 onto each side. 185 pounds. It was an ambitious jump. I had seen her working sets at 155, moving them with a fluid, hydraulic power. But 30 pounds is a chasm when you are lying on your back with gravity pressing down on your throat. It was a calculated risk. I respected it. It was the kind of arrogance that is necessary for growth, the belief that your will is stronger than the iron. I should have turned back to my own bar. I should have put my headphones back on and pulled my next set. But I couldn't. The professional instinct, the spotter in me, was warring with the unspoken rule of the late-night gym. You do not intervene unless asked. You stay in your lane. But the pull was undeniable. It wasn't just about safety. It was about the vulnerability of the lift. The bench press exposes the throat, the chest, the vital organs. It forces you to surrender your defense mechanisms. Watching her prepare for it, seeing the way she lay back and exposed herself to the weight, triggered a protective instinct in me that was sharp and sudden. I stood up, abandoning my set. I moved to the edge of the platform, wiping my chalked hands on my shorts. In the mirror, I saw her unrack the weight. Her elbows were tucked, her wrists straight, perfect geometry. But as the bar descended, I saw the flaw. It was microscopic, invisible to the untrained eye, but glaring to me. Her right tricep fluttered. Just a tremor, a tiny structural weakness in the architecture she had built. The bar touched her chest with a soft, controlled tap, but when she initiated the press, the speed wasn't there. The explosiveness she usually commanded was gone, replaced by a slow, grinding struggle. The bar moved 3 inches, then 4. Then it slowed, the velocity dying as the mechanical disadvantage kicked in. I watched her fight it. I saw the arch in her back deepen, her heels driving into the rubber floor so hard I thought she might crack the foundation. She was unflinching, her face a mask of pure, strained determination. But physics is a cruel opponent. The bar stalled. It hovered there, halfway up, caught in the dead zone. She held it. God, she held it, refusing to let it crash, but she couldn't push it an inch further. The silence of the room shattered. The tension snapped. I didn't think. I moved. I crossed the distance between the platform and the bench in 3 long strides, the sound of my lifting shoes heavy on the mats. I wasn't an observer anymore. I was the intervention. The new girl was gone. The spotter had arrived. There is a specific, terrifying mathematics to failure. It doesn't happen all at once. It is a calculated erosion of leverage, a slow-motion dismantling of the belief that you are stronger than the object you are trying to move. For the first 2 seconds of the stall, I was still in denial. The bar was motionless, suspended 3 inches above my sternum, but my mind insisted this was just a sticking point. I told myself it was a pause, a momentary lapse in the kinetic chain that I could overcome with sheer will. I drove my heels harder into the rubber floor, seeking a reserve of power in my posterior chain that simply wasn't there. I pushed. I pushed until the capillaries in my face felt like they were ready to burst, until the blood roared in my ears like a distant subway train. But the bar didn't move. It had become a fixed point in the universe, an immovable fact that I was currently pinned beneath. The denial evaporated, replaced instantly by a cold, clinical assessment of my predicament. I was alone. I was under 185 pounds of tempered steel. And I was failing. The burn started in the lateral head of my triceps, a sharp, acidic heat that spread rapidly down to my elbows. My stabilizer muscles, the small, unsung heroes of the shoulder girdle, began to misfire. The bar drifted a millimeter toward my neck, a microscopic shift that sent a shockwave of primal fear straight to my lizard brain. This wasn't just a failed rep anymore. This was a threat to my physical integrity. The architecture of my form, which I had built with such meticulous care, began to crumble. My elbows flared out, losing the tight, tucked position that protected the joint. My arch collapsed slightly, lengthening the distance the bar had to travel, making the impossible lift even harder. I was trapped in a cage of my own making. I had put the collars on the bar, a habit born of safety, now a sentence of confinement. I couldn't tip the weights off. I couldn't roll the bar down my body without crushing my rib cage. I was static. The gym, which moments ago had felt like a sanctuary of silence, now felt vast and indifferent. The hum of the HVAC system sounded distant, detached. The mirrors on the walls reflected my struggle back to me, a silent, infinite regression of a woman losing a fight with gravity. Time dilated. The 3 seconds I spent fighting the stall felt like 3 hours. I could feel the texture of the knurling biting into the webbing of my thumbs, the steel warm from the friction of my grip. My vision began to tunnel. The peripheral world, the dumbbell racks, the cardio machines, the exit sign, blurred into a gray smear. The only thing in focus was the center of the bar and the harsh, unforgiving glare of the fluorescent light fixture directly above me. It was blinding, a white-hot eye staring down at my vulnerability. I tried to breathe, to reset my intra-abdominal pressure, but the weight was compressing my chest, making a full inhalation impossible. I was taking shallow, panicked sips of air. My arms were shaking now, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that rattled the plates against the bar. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was small, but in the stillness of the room, it was a fire alarm. It was the sound of weakness. It was the sound of my control shattering. I realized then that I had 2 choices. I could drop the bar on my chest and hope nothing broke, or I could scream for help. The executive in me, the woman who negotiates mergers and fires incompetent VPs without blinking, recoiled at both options. To scream was to admit defeat. To scream was to shatter the carefully curated image of the solitary, self-sufficient entity I presented to the world. But as my triceps gave their final shudder of exhaustion and the bar began its slow, inexorable descent toward my throat, The choice was made for me. I opened my mouth, the air catching in my constricted throat, but before the sound could escape, the light above me changed. The harsh glare was suddenly cut, blocked by a shape that moved with fluid, urgent purpose. The shadow fell over my face, cooling the panic, breaking the isolation. It wasn't a random interference. It was a specific, directed arrival. Then, hands entered my visual field. They didn't grab the bar. They hovered beneath it, palms open, fingers spread. They were close enough that I could see the calluses on the pads of the fingers, the tension in the tendons. They framed the steel, creating a sudden, tangible safety net between the crushing weight and my failing body. I wasn't lifting alone anymore. The variable had changed. The unspoken social contract of the gym floor is built entirely on boundaries. You stay in your lane. You keep your eyes on your own reflection. You respect the invisible perimeter that every lifter draws around their station like a chalk outline. But when the bar stalls and the safety catches are set too low, those boundaries evaporate. Physics doesn't care about etiquette, and gravity doesn't wait for permission. I stepped into the breach. It was a violation of space that felt both aggressive and inevitable. I moved inside the footprint of the bench, my thighs bracing against the vinyl padding near her head. I was no longer an observer on the periphery. I was the sky above her. The transition from the open floor to this intimate, high-stakes pocket of air was jarring. The temperature seemed to spike by 10 degrees instantly. I could feel the heat radiating off her body, a tangible wave of thermal energy generated by muscles firing at absolute capacity. It hit me in the face, carrying the scent of the struggle, the metallic tang of iron, the dry dust of chalk, and beneath it all, something startlingly complex. She didn't smell like the gym. She didn't smell like the acrid, stale sweat of the cardio bunnies or the heavy musk of the powerlifters. She smelled like sandalwood and cold, expensive ambition. It was a sharp, woodsy fragrance that cut through the sterile atmosphere of the room, a sensory detail that had no business being this close to my face. It distracted me for a fraction of a second, a glitch in my focus, before the reality of the weight snapped me back. I didn't grab the bar. Not yet. To grab the bar before it starts to descend is the ultimate insult to a lifter of her caliber. It says, I don't trust you. It says, you are weak. I knew, just by watching the architecture of her struggle, that Nova would rather die under that iron than have me steal the rep from her. So I hovered. I placed my hands under the steel, palms open, fingers splayed wide, creating a cradle of potential energy. I was close enough to touch it, close enough to feel the vibration of her tremors transferring through the air. But I left a millimeter of space. Drive, I said. My voice was low, a command dropped directly into the space between us. It wasn't a shout. It didn't need to be. In this proximity, a whisper lands like a hammer. I looked down at her. The view from the spotter's position is a unique vantage point of vulnerability. Usually, Nova is a fortress, impenetrable, composed, armored in high-end compression gear and an icy demeanor. But from here, looking straight down into her face, the armor was cracked. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the ceiling, the pupils blown with adrenaline. Her teeth were grit together, the tendons in her neck standing out like cables under the strain. I could see the pulse hammering in the hollow of her throat, a frantic, visible rhythm that matched the shaking of her arms. The bar dipped. That was a signal. The millimeter of space between my skin and the steel vanished. I didn't grip it. I simply met it. I applied an upward force that was surgical in its precision, 10 pounds, maybe 15, just enough to neutralize the gravity that was winning, but not enough to invalidate the work she was doing. I became the external stabilizer she had lost. I've got you, I murmured, the words slipping out before I could filter them. It was a professional statement, a confirmation of safety, but in the heavy, charged silence of the room, it sounded like a vow. The sensation of the weight in my hands was electric. I wasn't just holding a barbell. I was plugged into her kinetic chain. I could feel the exact moment her triceps caught a second wind, the microscopic shift in leverage as she realized she wasn't going to be crushed. The vibration of her struggle traveled through the bar, into my palms, and up my arms, grounding us in the same physical loop. I was leaning over her, my core braced, my face dangerously close to hers to track the bar path. For a moment, the rest of the gym ceased to exist. The mirrors, the racks, the empty treadmills, they all fell away into a blurred background. There was only the vertical line between her chest and my hands, a narrow, heated corridor where we were locked together by necessity. She pushed, I guided. The bar began to move again, agonizingly slow, fighting for every inch of elevation. I kept my hands glued to the steel, moving in perfect sync with her ascent, a shadow lifting the light. I watched her eyes squeeze shut for a second, her face contorting with the raw, ugly effort of the grind. It wasn't pretty. It was visceral. It was the most honest thing I had seen in this city of glass towers and fake smiles. She was breaking herself against the iron, and I was the only thing keeping the pieces together. The bar cleared the sticking point. Her elbows locked out with a sharp, definitive snap. The rep was done. The weight was suspended at arm's length, stable once more. Logic dictated that I should guide it back into the J-hooks, rack it, and step away. I should retreat to the neutral ground of the deadlift platform and let the walls go back up. But I didn't. I stood there, my hands still touching the bar, my body still casting a shadow over hers, holding the connection for a heartbeat longer than survival required. The air between us was no longer just thick. It was solid. We were suspended in the aftermath, the adrenaline crash looming but not yet arrived, caught in the gravity of a proximity that neither of us seemed ready to break. The bar was locked out. My elbows were straight, the skeletal structure of my arms taking the load off the exhausted muscle, transferring the 185 pounds directly into my shoulder joints and down into the bench. The rep was saved. The immediate, primal threat of being crushed was gone. Logic dictated that the next movement in the sequence was backward, a horizontal shift to return the bar to the J-hooks, followed by the metallic clang of safety and the release of tension. That was the protocol. That was the safe conclusion to a failed structural test. But the bar didn't move backward, and neither did she. I lay there, pinned between the iron and the vinyl, staring up into a space that was no longer empty. Usually, my view is the acoustic ceiling tiles, counting the water stains to distract myself from the burn. Now, my horizon was entirely occupied by Jordan. She hadn't stepped back. She hadn't retreated to the respectful distance of the deadlift platform. She remained inside the perimeter, her body creating a canopy over mine, blocking out the harsh fluorescent glare that usually triggered my migraines. The sudden intimacy of the position was jarring. In my world, the world of glass-walled offices and boardroom tables, power is established through distance. You sit at the head of the table. You keep the desk between you and the subordinate. Proximity is a weakness. But here, under the weight, proximity was the only thing keeping the disaster at bay. I was acutely, violently aware of her body hovering inches above mine. It wasn't a passive presence. It was a kinetic force field. I could feel the heat radiating from her. It wasn't a vague warmth. It was a specific, directed thermal output from a body that had just sprinted across the gym floor to save me. It washed over my face, mixing with the cool draft of the air conditioning, creating a microclimate that existed solely between her chest and mine. It was suffocating. It was electric. My eyes traced the line of her arms. She wasn't touching the bar anymore, not really. Her palms were hovering millimeters beneath the steel, a ghost grip ready to materialize the second gravity tried to reclaim me. I looked at her forearms. They were tense, the muscles defined and corded, veins tracing a map of effort under the skin. These weren't the soft, manicured hands of the people I shook hands with at charity galas. These were tools. They were calloused, dusted with chalk, and capable. There was a brutal competence in the way she held her position, a stillness that spoke louder than the chaotic noise of the gym. I should have been uncomfortable. I should have been furious at the invasion. I am a woman who meticulously curates her solitude. I wear noise-canceling headphones, not just for the music, but as a do not disturb sign hung around my neck. Having a stranger this close, invading the personal zone I guard with such ferocity, should have triggered a fight-or-flight response, but it didn't. Instead, a strange, heavy calm settled in my chest. It was the relief of abdication. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one holding the ceiling up. I wasn't the one responsible for the structural integrity of the moment. She was. I looked up past her hands to her face. She wasn't looking at me, not in the eyes. She was watching the bar with a gaze that was terrifyingly intense. Her focus was absolute. She was tracking the stability of the load, her jaw set, her breathing synchronized with the stillness of the room. There was no judgment in her expression, no pity for the failed rep. There was only a professional, unflinching assessment of the physics involved. She was the spotter, and for this suspended second, she was the god of this small, iron universe. The silence stretched. The background noise at the gym, the treadmill motors, the distant thud of dumbbells, the terrible pop music, faded into a dull gray static. The only sound that mattered was the rhythm of our breathing. Mine was ragged, shallow gasps trying to repay the oxygen debt of the struggle. Hers was steady, deep, and controlled, a metronome forcing my own pulse to slow down. "Racket?" she whispered. Her voice was a low vibration that I felt in my chest more than I heard. It wasn't a command, it was an option. She was giving me the choice to end the exposure, to put the weight away and retreat to safety. I looked at the J-hooks. They were right there. A 3-inch movement backward, and I would be free. I could sit up, mutter a polite thanks, and leave. I could go to the locker room, shower, and pretend this breach of my defenses never happened. But the adrenaline was still singing in my blood. The fear of the failure had transmuted into something sharper, something reckless. I felt the stability of her hands hovering under the bar, a safety net that I had never had before. I had failed because I was alone. I wasn't alone anymore. The variable had changed. The architecture was reinforced. I looked at her eyes. She shifted her gaze down, locking onto mine. The intensity of it almost made me drop the bar right then. It was a challenge. It was a question. I tightened my grip on the steel, feeling the knurling bite into my skin. I retracted my shoulder blades again, resetting the platform. I took a breath, a deep, expansive inhale that pressed my ribcage against the tightness of my belt. "No," I breathed out. Again. The command was quiet, breathless, and absolute. It defied every law of physiology I knew. Her central nervous system was fried. Her glycogen stores were depleted. To attempt a maximal load immediately after a near failure wasn't training. It was an exorcism. A rational trainer would have stripped the plates. A rational person would have told her to go home. But standing there, looking down into eyes that were dark with a reckless, terrifying need, I wasn't feeling particularly rational. I was feeling useful. I didn't argue. I didn't waste breath on a safety lecture she wouldn't hear. I simply nodded, a microscopic dip of my chin, and tightened my stance. "Reset," I said. My voice was the only anchor in the room. She took a breath that seemed to pull the walls of the gym inward. I watched her arch reestablish itself, the violent contortion of her spine that turned her body into a loaded spring. She unracked the bar. It was heavier this time. I could feel it. The fatigue was a third entity in the lift, sitting on the center of the steel, adding invisible pounds. I moved in. I violated the buffer zone completely. To spot a lift like this, you can't be polite. You have to be invasive. I leaned over the bench, my chest hovering inches above the bar, my elbows locked into my sides. I created a canopy of focus, blocking out the ceiling, the lights, the mirrors. For the next 10 seconds, her entire world was the gray steel bar and my face watching it. "Control," I whispered. She lowered it. The eccentric phase was agonizing. I watched the fibers of her deltoids tremble under the skin of her shoulders. She was fighting gravity for every millimeter. The bar touched her chest, not a bounce, but a pause, a dead stop. This was the danger zone. This was where the kinetic energy died and had to be resurrected from nothing. "Drive," I commanded. She pushed. The bar moved an inch, then 2. Then it hit the wall. The same sticking point. The same brutal, invisible ceiling. Her arms began to shake, a violent, oscillating tremor that threatened to dump the weight sideways. She groaned, a raw, guttural sound that was stripped of all corporate polish. It was the sound of an animal caught in a trap. I didn't lift it for her. That would be theft. But I didn't let it drop. I slid my hands under the bar, my skin grazing the cold steel but not gripping it. I became the safety catch. I applied just enough upward pressure to cancel out the tremor, to stabilize the path. I felt the vibration of her struggle in my own bones. My core was braced so hard it burned, my own muscles mirroring the tension of hers. I was holding the line between her ambition and her injury. She looked at me then. Her eyes were wide, panic fringing the edges of her irises. She was doubting. She was about to quit. I leaned closer, invading her vision, forcing her to look at me instead of the weight. "I can do this all night," I whispered. The words were soft, intimate, dropping into the space between us like a stone into deep water. It was a lie. My lower back was screaming. But it was the lie she needed. It was a promise of infinite support. It told her that I wasn't going anywhere, that I would stand over her and hold this weight until the sun came up, if that's what it took for her to finish the rep. Something shifted in her face. The panic receded, replaced by a sharp, cold clarity. She didn't want to let me down. It wasn't about the weight anymore. It was about the witness. She gritted her teeth, a snarl of effort pulling her lips back, and she drove her heels into the floor. I felt the shift in the bar. It got lighter in my hands. She was generating force again, summoning energy from some deep, dark reserve I didn't know she had. The bar crept up, past the sticking point, past the danger zone. I kept my hands right there, shadowing the movement, rising with her like smoke. I watched the strain in her neck, the way the tendons stood out in sharp relief against her flushed skin. I saw a bead of sweat roll from her temple and disappear into her hairline. The vulnerability of it, her throat exposed, her chest heaving, her body pinned under the iron while I stood over her, was a heady, dangerous drug. "Lock it out," I hissed. Her elbows snapped straight. The weight was up. The victory was absolute. I guided the bar back into the J-hooks. The metal-on-metal clang was the loudest sound in the world. It signaled the end of the set. The end of the danger. But I didn't pull away. I stayed there, leaning over the bench, my hands still resting on the racked bar, my breath coming a little faster than it should have. I looked down at her. She was wrecked. She was beautiful. And for a long, suspended moment, neither of us moved to break the seal we had just created. The metallic clang of the bar hitting the J-hooks didn't just signal the end of the set. It sounded like a gate slamming shut on the rest of the world. I lay there for a moment, the vinyl bench slick with my own sweat against my shoulder blades, staring up at the ceiling tiles. They were vibrating. Or maybe I was. The physical aftermath of a maximal effort lift is a chaotic biological event. My heart was hammering against my ribs with a violence that felt sustainable only for seconds, a frantic, thudding rhythm trying to circulate oxygen that wasn't there. My triceps were numb, buzzing with a phantom electricity, and my lungs burned with a cold chemical fire. I needed to sit up. The vulnerability of lying supine, chest exposed, throat open, was suddenly intolerable. I engaged my core, forcing my body to hinge upward, but the movement was clumsy. I swung my legs around and sat on the edge of the bench, elbows resting on my knees, head hanging low. The rush of blood from my head to my feet was immediate and disorienting. The gym floor, the black rubber mats, the scuffed edges of the platform swayed gently in my vision. Gray spots danced in the periphery, threatening to close in. I closed my eyes, breathing through my nose, trying to force my physiology back into the rigid box of control I usually kept it in. But I wasn't alone in the box anymore. I could feel her. Jordan hadn't moved. The heat I had felt while pinned under the bar was still there, radiating against the side of my face and my bare shoulder. I opened my eyes and looked to my left. She was standing inside the bench's footprint, her lifting shoes planted firmly on the rubber, invading the personal space that I usually guarded with the ferocity of a junkyard dog. She wasn't looking at the bar. She wasn't looking at her phone. She was looking at me. The proximity was aggressive. In the corporate world, standing this close to someone who is seated is a power move, a way to dominate the vertical space. But Jordan wasn't posturing. She was breathing. Her chest rose and fell in a rhythm that matched mine, a synchronized recovery that felt uncomfortably intimate. I could see a sheen of sweat on her collarbone, the way a stray lock of hair clung to her temple. She looked wrecked, stripped of the cool, detached observer persona she had worn for weeks. She looked like she had just lifted the weight herself. "You stayed," I said. My voice was rough, a jagged scrape of sound that lacked any of my usual polish. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation, or maybe a confession. "You didn't stop," she countered. Her voice was still low, that same dangerous whisper that had gotten me through the sticking point. She crossed her arms over her chest, the movement drawing my eye to the flex of her forearms. Most people would have racked it after the first stall. "I don't like leaving things unfinished," I muttered, reaching for my water bottle. My hand was shaking. It was a fine, tremors-like vibration that I couldn't suppress. I gripped the bottle hard, white-knuckling the plastic to hide the weakness, but I knew she saw it. She didn't say anything. She didn't offer a platitude about good effort. She just watched my hand, her gaze unflinching, acknowledging the cost of the lift. The silence between us stretched, but it wasn't the empty, sterile silence of the gym anymore. It was thick, heavy, and charged. It was the kind of silence that follows a car crash or a kiss, the stunned suspension of time after an impact. I took a drink, the water cold and shocking against my parched throat, and tried to rebuild my walls. I needed to be the executive again. I needed to be the woman who owned the room, not the woman who had just been saved by a stranger. I stood up. The movement was sudden, a bid to reclaim the vertical advantage. I unbuckled my lifting belt, the leather making a sharp creak as I pulled it loose. The pressure release on my abdomen was instant, but it left me feeling exposed in a new way. Without the belt, without the bar, without the bench, there was nothing between us. "That was," I started, looking for a word that was professional, technical, safe. "Heavy," she finished for me. She stepped back then, finally granting me a foot of breathing room, but the connection didn't break. Her eyes held mine, dark and intelligent, stripping away the pretense. "It was heavy, Nova, and you handled it." She knew my name. I hadn't introduced myself. The realization sent a prickle of heat down my neck that had nothing to do with the workout. She had been watching. She had been doing the research. The dossier was open. "I had help," I said, keeping my voice steady, locking my eyes on hers. I refused to look away first. It was a test. "You held the line. I just kept the ceiling off you," she said, a small ghost of a smile touching the corner of her mouth. "You did the work." The air around us felt volatile, as if a spark could ignite the oxygen we were both fighting for. This wasn't shop talk. This wasn't two bros high-fiving over a PR. This was a negotiation of a different sort, a recognition of mutual gravity. The workout was effectively over. I couldn't go do tricep pushdowns after this. The intensity of the moment had eclipsed the program. I grabbed my gym bag, swinging it onto my shoulder. It was a retreat, and we both knew it. I needed to get off the floor. I needed the sterile neutrality of the locker room. I needed to be away from the heat she was generating. "I'm done for the night," I said, the words sounding final, like I was closing a deal. "See you around," Jordan said. She didn't move to leave. She stayed rooted to the spot, watching me. I turned and walked toward the locker room corridor. I didn't look back. I focused on the rhythm of my boots on the rubber floor, counting the steps, trying to regulate my breathing. But I could feel her gaze on my back, a physical weight pressing between my shoulder blades. My skin was prickling, my senses dialed up to a painful frequency. I had cleared the weight, but I had the distinct, terrifying sensation that the real heavy lifting was just about to start. I stood there for a count of 10 after the door to the main corridor swung shut behind her. The gym floor, usually a landscape of kinetic potential, suddenly felt like a stage after the lead actor had exited. The hum of the HVAC system, the rhythmic thud of a treadmill runner, the distant clatter of plates, it all sounded hollow. The energy had left the room with her. I looked down at my hands. They were still trembling slightly, a microscopic vibration in the fingers that had held her safety. It wasn't fatigue. It was the residual charge of contact. I couldn't go back to my deadlifts. The idea of gripping a cold bar for the sake of mechanics felt absurd. The workout was dead, The narrative of the night had shifted. I stripped the weights off my bar, sliding the 45-pound plates onto the rack with a dull, rhythmic thudding. It was the only closure I could offer the gym floor. I grabbed my bag, slinging it over one shoulder, and turned toward the exit. I wasn't chasing her. Chasing implies a frantic need to capture something fleeing. This wasn't a chase. It was a pursuit. It was the inevitable realignment of two objects caught in the same gravitational well. She had walked away, yes, but she hadn't severed the connection. She had simply moved the venue. The tension that had built up under the bench press, the heat, the sweat, the terrifying intimacy of shared strain, couldn't be resolved by a simple goodbye. It demanded a conclusion. The walk from the free weight section to the locker rooms is a transition between worlds. You leave the erratic, loud, aggressive ecosystem of the gym floor, a place of rubber, iron, and grunting effort, and enter a sterile, muffled purgatory. As I pushed through the double doors into the hallway, the sound cut out instantly. The air here was cooler, stiller. The lighting shifted from the harsh industrial overheads to a softer, recessed glow that reflected off the polished beige tiles. My footsteps sounded loud in the corridor, a steady, deliberate cadence. Click, click, click. I analyzed the feeling in my chest as I walked. It was a tightness, a pull that felt physical, like a hook set deep behind my sternum. I've had gym crushes before. I've admired form, appreciated aesthetics. This was different. This was recognition. When I looked at Nova, I didn't just see a beautiful woman. I saw a mirror. I saw the same discipline, the same rigid architecture of control, the same desperate need to silence the noise of the world with heavy things. And tonight, I had seen the crack in that architecture. I had put my hands on it. I wondered if she was waiting, or if she was rushing to shower and escape, to scrub the vulnerability off her skin before I could witness it again. The thought made me walk faster. I didn't want her to rebuild the walls yet. I wanted to see what was behind them when the mortar was still wet. I reached the heavy wooden door marked Women. I paused, my hand hovering over the brushed steel handle. This was the threshold. Out here, in the hallway, we were still just two patrons of a high-end fitness club. Inside, in the steam and the privacy of the changing room, the rules of engagement changed. The social contract of the gym floor didn't apply. I took a breath, steadying the sudden spike in my pulse. I wasn't going in there to corner her. I was going in there because the silence between us was a weight I couldn't rack alone. I gripped the handle. It was cool and solid. I pulled. The latch clicked, a sharp mechanical sound that echoed in the quiet hallway. The door swung open, and the air pressure shifted instantly, a warm, humid exhalation rushing out to meet me, carrying the scent of eucalyptus and the undeniable, heavy presence of her. The locker room is a decompression chamber. It is designed to strip away the grime of the city and the sweat of the effort, leaving you polished and neutral before you re-enter the world. But tonight, the white tiles and chrome fixtures felt less like a sanctuary and more like an interrogation room. I stood at the sink, the automatic faucet running a steady stream of cold water over my hands. I was scrubbing the chalk off, watching the white powder turn to a gray paste and swirl down the drain. It was a mundane task, a ritual of cleaning up, but my pulse was still hammering a frantic rhythm against the porcelain edge of the basin. I didn't hear the door open so much as I felt the vacuum of the room break. The heavy, humid air from the showers shifted, replaced by a draft from the hallway. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I looked up into the expanse of the mirror that stretched above the sinks. Jordan was there. She had stopped just inside the threshold, her gym bag slung over one shoulder, the door clicking softly shut behind her. In the harsh, unforgiving lighting of the vanity, we looked different. On the gym floor, we were armored in motion and adrenaline. Here, standing still in the steam-hazed air, the armor was gone. My hair was escaping its tie, damp at the temples. My face was flushed with the exertion of the lift. I felt exposed, not just physically, but structurally. She had seen the point of failure. She had held the weight of my ambition in her hands. She walked further into the room, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the tile. She didn't move to a locker. She didn't move to the showers. She came to the sink next to mine, dropping her bag on the floor with a heavy thud. She didn't turn on the water. She just leaned against the counter, facing me, her hip resting against the cool laminate.
"You scrub any harder, you're going to take the skin off," she said.
Her voice was stripped of the whisper she had used under the bar. It was clear, low, and vibrating with a quiet amusement. I turned off the faucet. The sudden silence in the room was aggressive. The only sound was the distant hum of the ventilation and the dripping of a shower head somewhere in the stalls. I reached for a paper towel, taking my time, drying my hands with a deliberate, surgical precision. "You held it close," I said. I kept my eyes on my hands, watching the paper absorb the moisture. "The bar. You were inside the contact zone."
"I was where I needed to be," she replied.
I could feel her gaze on the side of my face, unflinching and heavy. "If I stood back, you would have dumped it. You needed to know the safety net was tight." I turned to face her then. The distance between us was less than 2 feet. In the narrow aisle between the sinks and the lockers, the proximity felt dangerous. The air was thick with the scent of eucalyptus steam and the lingering, sharp electricity of the spot. "I could have cleared it," I lied. It was a reflex, the executive in me trying to rewrite the minutes of the meeting. "Maybe," Jordan conceded, though her eyes said she knew better. She took a half step closer, invading the space I usually kept sterile. "But you didn't want to clear it alone. That's why you didn't rack it when I gave you the out." The truth of it hung in the damp air. She was right. The lift hadn't been about the weight. It had been about the trust. It had been about surrendering the architecture of control to someone who knew exactly how to hold it. "I'm here every night," I said. It was the closest thing to an invitation I had ever given. "I know," she said. "So am I." I grabbed my bag, the leather strap feeling cool in my palm. I walked past her, the space so tight that my arm brushed against hers. A fleeting electric contact that sent a shockwave straight to my chest. I didn't stop. I pushed through the door, leaving the steam and the silence behind. The automatic doors slid shut behind me, sealing the cool night air around me. The city was loud, chaotic, and indifferent, but my skin was still humming with the memory of the silence we had shared. I looked at my hand, still feeling the ghost of the iron and the heat of her proximity. The weight was racked, but the lift wasn't over. If you understand the weight of a shared silence, subscribe for more.